So I wanted to talk about interference and how it's affected our hobby over the years. Now, I got into amateur radio in the 70s, and that back then there was still interference, but you would turn your radio on and it would be minimal. Maybe it's some power line noise, maybe it's the Russian woodpecker, but it wasn't as big a thing. It would be annoying. You could live with it, like bushflies and bad weather. You just sort of lived with it. But over time, this has crept up and has infiltrated just about every part of the hobby. One of the good things about coming here straight after Paul is that he's already asked the question, how many people have noise problems at home? And I think most of the people in the room are experiencing some level of background noise. Now, what I wanted to talk about was some of the things you can do to try and minimize that, and how we can perhaps take control of our own destiny a little bit when it comes to noise mitigation. So it is a problem. It's come up right through suburbia, and even when you are going portable, if you're taking some equipment with you, you're going to be taking noise with you, and it might be something as simple as the little dongle in your cigarette lighter, which is a USB charger. They're enough to take out a hunk of spectrum on HF. And the support on this has been minimal. There's a lot of YouTube clips on what you can do on and some good ideas. I can't get too technical here, or Justin will be tapping his watch very quickly, but I want to look at some of the directions that you can go in to try and help these problems. So we have been fairly poorly represented, and this has gotten worse. The ACMA, without being too judgmental here, have fewer resources than ever before to assist with problems, so that if you do have an interference problem, you're not going to be able to ring up and say, hey, I've got this noise, I don't know where it's coming from, come and fix it. It's not going to happen. If you're going to get any assistance at all, it's only after you've presented a fairly strong case identifying the source and showing how you have not been able to deal with it yourself. So you're not going to get the regulator proactively jumping in and helping you unless it's an extreme case and there's no way forward. So we do have to accept that reducing our interference problems are part of the hobby, and we have to take control a little bit. And it is a skill set. So you turn your radio on and you do hear some noise. It's too easy to say, oh, what can I do? And turn it back off again. In fact, that's a real bummer for anyone who's trying to get into the hobby. We had Steve earlier this morning talking about those who were fresh to the hobby and they needed incentives and need a little bit of support. Now, if they go through that process and they get their license and put up their antenna and they turn on a radio and there's an S9 noise, they're not going to stick with the hobby for very long. It's just going to put them off. They're going to go on and do something else. So what we did with the RASA group, we started a website to help mitigate noise, as a resource to help people to mitigate noise. And I want to talk a little bit about that. But first, this is a fairly simple matrix. There's 4 boxes, and it defines the sort of interference you're going to experience, that your radio receiver is being interfered with by another source, or that your radio is interfering with somebody else's radio, like classic television interference. And on the bottom right, we've got your transmissions are affecting somebody else's non-radio equipment. It could well be that every time you get on 40 meters that you reboot your neighbor's NBN modem, and they don't like it. And the last box, non-amateur equipment is being affected by an interference source. And that's a little bit significant, because while it doesn't look like it affects us, it does in many ways. And it's also an opportunity. I'll come back to that, because if it comes to making a claim about noise, if you can show that that noise is affecting equipment other than amateur radio, a commercial service of some kind, then that can boost the your case for something to be done about it. So QRM Guru, it's a website. It's a knowledge-based platform, and I'll describe what that actually means in this case. We launched it at Perth Tech in 2019, not quite sure knowing where it was going to go, we produced a lot of little articles and had some contributions by a collection of amateurs. And it has been a collaborative effort, and it has grown. If you go to QRM.Guru, this is what you see. It's fairly plain front end, but there's a lot of articles, images, and videos on all sorts of different topics about dealing with QRM. And you might put in something like solar panels, and you'll get a list of articles that are about solar panels, the problems that people have had, good ones and bad ones, and things that you can do. For instance, we know that there are good and bad solar arrays, and a lot of people have got solar panels on their home, their roofs at home. The Fronius ones, they're pretty good. A lot of people who have those systems don't experience any noise. And I know some other guys who got those little micro inverters where every second panel's got its own little inverter, and that just makes a cloud of noise over their home. And if they basically can't operate during daylight hours. So there's good ones and bad ones. Happy to say that they're getting better, and most of the new kit that's going into houses now is pretty quiet. The page also goes down to a section of videos, and some of this is an introduction to the process. And this is what I do want to emphasize, that, okay, if you do have noise, there are steps you can take, and it's going to be things like, what does it sound like? Or what times of the day does it appear? What frequencies is it on? Is it solid? Is it moving around? So you've got to try and profile this noise source and take notes. And the taking of the notes is very important too, because if you ever do have to escalate with a power company, you've got to show an evidence path, things that you've tried, and something you can point at. So you gather information about the noise. What are the circumstances around it? Is it something that only happens on windy days, only on still days, hot days, cold days? There's going to be things about that noise which make it unique and help you to find out what it is. And then there's a set of tools to help you to locate the source. Now, one of the things that we had put up was a simple DF loop, a coax loop. I didn't bring any samples with me today because I'm traveling light. But that's a very common design. You can put it on a general coverage receiver, tune to 10 meg or another frequency, and have a listen around, and you can actually chase, using a null with a very simple loop, the source of that noise. One of the first things I recommend is try to set up your shack on battery power and kill the power in your own house. And if the noise goes, that's a good thing. It means it's something you can control. But if the noise is still there, it gets harder. You're going to have to look a bit further up and down the street. An example is corona discharge on power lines. That is a real nasty one and can propagate on HF a couple of kilometres either side of the noise source. Now, you can complain, and there is a process for the power companies they're obliged to react to that complaint, even though they might try and talk you down and talk you out of it. There is an actual requirement for them to respond. But in order to make that step, you've really got to bring it down to a very close area. If you can give them a pole designation where there's a fault, then they'll respond to that. So take your handheld, take your loop, and go for a walk up and down the street. And if it's very strong noise, go up in frequency with your handheld. The highest frequency that you can hear that noise also reduces the area of that noise and will allow you to pin it down, hopefully down to a single pole. That's like one of the strategies. And then you can try and use some more directional equipment. And there's an image, I'll show you up a little later on how we can use infrared and ultrasonic reception to try and pinpoint where on a power pole the noise source might be coming from. So one of the other things about getting rid of the noise are the things you can do to the shack. And part of that was ferrite materials. And ferrites are a bit of a dark art. There's squillions of articles, engineering articles, good quality articles on ferrite materials, the types, lots of charts. Sometimes it's hard to equate how that applies to amateur radio when it comes to suppression. What combinations are going to be good for you? One of the first articles we did, we tried to look at different ferrites and see what was most applicable. because you could get them off eBay, you could get them off Ultronics, Element 14, and the prices varied wildly. But how did that affect the performance? Well, that was one of the questions that came up. So we bought a selection of them, profiled them, and the answer was that they didn't vary very much. So it doesn't matter where you're buying your ferrites from, most of it's pretty good. And now there are some ferrites have got a different curve that will make it work better at VHF or at the bottom of HF, and that's certainly the case, and it's very important for balance. But by the time you start piling lots of turns on, around, or through ferrite materials, then that becomes less important. That's what the experiments have shown. So one of the things we did through to help this process was to make up some basic ferrite kits and made those available. But I'm not here to sell those today. There are a couple, I think, up for the raffle too, aren't there? That's good. But it's a starting point, so that if somebody wants to do something about that interference, then you can say, okay, well, even if you only get a loan of some of these things, then it's worth trying. We produced a series of kits, and I think we'll be organising one for down here as well, which we've donated to clubs, which is like a starters pack. It's a range of ferrite connections, loop antennas, and basic instructions on how to go about that process. And we've, as we've been going around clubs around the country, we've donated 15 of those kits already. The idea is that you develop a bit of intelligence within the club community, a bit of expertise on how to go about and reduce these interference issues. I did an article, I called it The Truth About Ferrites, and once again it was not an engineering article, but it was trying to show how you could use them. There was a lot of myths and half pieces of information, like the snap-on ferrite rings. How many do you need? 1, 2, 3, 5? How do they compare to the rings? When would you use one over another? And all these sorts of things. So that article broke down on a band-by-band basis how the ferrites would actually impact noise levels from equipment. It might be on battery chargers. It might be trying to stop feed line noise coming into the shack. How can you use these devices? And it's interesting because you can put a ferrite clamp on and you get a small reduction, put another one on, put half a dozen on there, and yes, you get a decrease in noise. But if you can actually take a larger ferrite ring or clamp and get an extra couple of turns through it, there's a turns ratio effect, a squaring effect, and the attenuation goes up greatly. So you're actually better off with one ferrite that has more turns in it than a whole bunch of individual ferrites just going on one turn at a time. That went into the article and a YouTube video, and that turned out to be quite popular. So the process of gathering information, it's got to be the first step. Write down those clues. There are some forms on the website which help people to step-by-step go through that. There's a video on the step-by-step to gather that information. And there's a bunch of common sources. Now, when it comes to interference sources, it's actually a little bit too easy to say, okay, it's this, or this, and say it must be one of them, because every time we've done that, we've actually found another one and another one. I caught up with Alan VK3BUF at his location north of Mudgee in New South Wales, and we were having a bit of a sniff around his farm, and he was experiencing quite a lot of noise in an area where he shouldn't have it. He's on several hundred acres. But there it was quite loud, and it turned out that his garage had roller doors. Each one had a little motor, and when it's on standby, they were putting out an enormous amount of motorboating crud. 3 of them were all doing it. The power supplies were basically garbage. And we identified that was coming from his garage door openers. And when we turned them off, the noise level just halved. In that particular case, we tried a few things, but they were basically crap power supplies. And the easiest way forward was to buy some drop-in solutions from Element 14 that were the same size, shape, and output, and were electrically quiet. So there's no one answer that's going to help, but finding it is the first step. Yep. So the experience of other operators is very important. That when you do listen around, everyone has had an experience, and some of them good, some of them not so good. We are approaching Christmas, and that's the worst time for interference. And over the next month, all the decorations are going to be coming out. They're going to be going over trees, fences, front yards, and our noise level is just going to go up here. It's a shocker. We're surrounded by things that make square waves, and some of the Christmas lighting is amongst the worst, the cheapest, and the nastiest that you're going to encounter. And short of a set of side cutters or waiting until January, you're probably not going to get any peace. That was just a couple of pictures. One of the projects that we had this year was to look at, this is a kind of a divergent issue, look at whether or not electrical noise on power lines was a precursor to ignition sources. So we live in a country that's prone to fire danger. We have a lot of power line infrastructure, and we know that traditionally there have been some bad situations where bark and things have fallen on power lines and created fires, that there are heat sources when power lines are playing up. So Chris and myself and another gentleman, we wanted to have a look at whether or not we could see a relationship between RF noise coming from power lines and ignition sources. So our challenge, which we started, I guess around about April, was to go driving around looking for noise sources on power lines and see what the intensity of the thermal signature would be when we found those noises. Now, we did a lot of initial work, and that was all good. But then, for some reason, we had a lot of rain. And over the last couple of months, it hasn't really been conducive to finding noisy power lines. Our infrastructure has been washed pretty clean. So I'm going to resume this in the summer and see what we can find. And there will be a follow-up article on the results in the QTC magazine. But on the image there, you can see I'm holding up a little parabolic microphone. And that's basically an ultrasonic converter. Anywhere between 30 to 40 kilohertz gets down converted to human hearing. And if you go past somewhere where there's a corona discharge, you're going to hear it hissing and popping. It's actually a very useful tool for identifying sources of noise. You can even hear fluorescent lights buzzing. You can hear switch mode power supplies on the floor buzzing just by waving around the room. It's an interesting tool. And heat signature is an important one. And in this particular case, it's not going to be a piece of kit that everyone carries around, but usually where there's a noise coming from a piece of power line infrastructure, there's often a heat signature. And this has been another point I wanted to stress, that when we're trying to deal with noise, it's not just about us. It's actually good for the community as a whole. And this is something that you can use if you've got to knock on a neighbour's door and say, hey, your widgets are wiping out my hobby. Because the chances are it's also ruining his Wi-Fi and his speed rates and other pieces of equipment around his own home. So if you can help solve your amateur radio noise, you're actually going to help your neighbour as well. And there have been cases. We had a case study where someone reported a noise that was coming from a few doors up, and it turned out to be that there was a battery charger charging up some batteries for a golf buggy in a garage, and the charger was on its last legs. It was running very, very hot, about to have a meltdown, and it was radiating on HF. So that was a good outcome, because the owner was very horrified that his charger was about to set fire to his house and put the side cutters through the power lead. I mean, after he unplugged it.
Yes, Kevin.
That's right. It's not good for the side cutters either. So that was a good outcome in a way. And where there's interference, there's heat sources, and there is a scope for an ignition source as well. So it's a growing website. And I do suggest that you hop on there, have a bit of a look around at some of the articles, look at some of the processes. And if you have your own stories and experiences, we'd love to hear from you. and add it to the pool of experience, because the more that we put into it, the more effective it's going to be. And there have been a lot of visitations from around the world saying, okay, it's really good to have one central location where the experiences of interference can be spoken about. So it is educational, and rather than seeing it as just a pest, I think it's good to think of it as just another aspect of the hobby, and something where you do get better at finding out where something's coming from and what you can do about it, whether you're using ferrite rings on power leads, whether you're adding capacitors, applying mains filters, or in one case I had a DVD player, I put it in a log splitter, and that fixed the interference right up. There are remedies out there, and okay, the log split is probably the extreme end, but not without its value. Yeah, so think about it both at an individual level and at a club level, that if you can skill up and help each other, then that's a good thing. So one of the things that we've exercised recently is we've added a kind of a help desk, a ticketing system associated with QRM Guru, which allows people to pose questions and say, okay, I've got this situation, what do you think it's going to be? Well, in some of the cases, we're just going to be referring the person to the appropriate article consistent with what they're asking about. In some cases, we can provide some direct information. We don't have a flying squad that can go out and fix remedies all over the country, but hopefully we can point people in the right direction. So we've got a collection of about half a dozen agents who will respond to inquiries, and we'll channel that question through to the appropriate person. And look, if it comes to pass that it's not too far away and we can go out and help people, then we'll do so. But that depends on where they are, and we're all volunteers and on what our own capabilities are. So part of what we're trying to do is not just run a website. We want to roll out a national education and a knowledge program, so that people are just better at dealing with it and thinking about it, rather than saying, well, it's just too hard, I can't do anything about it, I'm going to put on a DVD instead. And if we can expand the network, then that's going to help us, because this is not going to get better by itself, and nobody's going to fix it for us. It's us or nobody. And that's just something we have to come to terms with. It's an integral part of our hobby of driving this interference down.
You told a story about a garage door opener and how you fixed it with a different power supply. How did you go about choosing a new power supply that was quieter? What did you look for?
Sure. A little bit of it. The garage door power supply, it's a good example. Well, there's a little bit of luck in it. Usually what goes into the product that's put into people's homes is the lowest common denominator. So what you actually get in a product as part of a larger system is going to be the cheapest one that they think they can get away with. In this particular case, the ones that show up on, say, the Element 14 website, they're going to have a set of specifications, and they're going to have an interference rating. And one of the first things to try was, okay, what can physically fit in the same space and has a similar current level? No point in putting a power supply in there if it only delivers half the available energy.
I think the interference rating was the key bit there.
Yes, that's right. So if the aftermarket ones that are on the likes of Element 14 or RS Components or Mouser, they'll usually be fairly high spec ones, and they'll usually be better than what you've got. There's no guarantees, but that's my experience.
NBN, fibre to the curb, fibre to the node, VDSL2, wipes out HF. And I know a lot of people that haven't actually identified that that's where the issue is until I've come along, because it's wiped out HF for me. I drive out of my suburb into a suburb where they've got fibre to the premises. Any help with that? Or is there anything happening at higher level with that?
Mostly it comes down to the modems themselves and
This is actually the lead-ins, the copper lead-ins.
Okay. What's coming into the street?
Yep.
Well, if you can prove that it's part of that infrastructure, that is, that you can actually unplug it from your modem and say the noise is still there, then you have a case. And getting back to that third slide where I said non-amateur radio equipment not interfering with non-amateur radio systems, if you can show that that same modem is wiping out ABC radio or an FM broadcast station or something like that.
You see it in the VDSL bandwidth. You can see it on an SDR. You can see a very sharp, what's the name there? So it wipes out HF. So I don't know. It just seems that nobody wants to do anything about it, sort of thing.
To a sense, if you once again, if you can localize it and do a report on it, that you've got a much greater chance of getting some reaction. There are statutory requirements for these organisations to have the noise below a certain threshold. The problem is enforcement and kind of almost rubbing their nose in it, saying this is definitely coming from your node, it's definitely your problem, and if you don't react to it, I'll have a conversation with the ombudsman who will enforce your obligation to reduce that threshold. That usually helps. But once again, you've got to be systematic, and the ombudsman's not going to help you unless you can produce a case to present to them where you have been very careful in your own observations.
Right, okay. Have you guys just, and I'm conscious of time, but have you guys actually encountered that issue, or is it an issue that people are even aware of? Because
I have. I guess most of the NBN problems I've seen have been in-house, with the interference coming in to the modem and coming out of the modem, and sometimes it's been fixed just by putting a different modem in, but usually the first point is that I would be using ferrite rings on every connection, data in, data out, and power lines in and out of that connection. But if it's external to your home, they're not going to be happy if you start cracking open pillars and sticking your own ferrites on them for some reason.
Just a comment where you're showing using the infrared on the poles and ultrasonic. You need a bit of psychology there. Apart from just saying it's causing interference to you as a ham, I suggest I'm worried about it starting a fire, particularly in rural areas.
Yes.
You'll get immediate response. So
And
just psychology helps in a lot of these things.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the reasons why Chris and I wanted to do that study, to try and find a concrete correlation, because the Country Fire Authority would be very interested. They tend to be reactive, and something's got hot and set fire, and then they think that's beginning. But no, I believe that long before something has gotten bad enough to start a fire, it's been wiping out a chunk of the spectrum as a precursor, and it's in everyone's interest if we try and locate those. So that's kind of where we're heading, but I don't want to preempt the results of that study. I want to gather evidence impartially.